Hello there, welcome to another special edition of African Football Archives, and today we are looking at Africa's 50 greatest footballers of all time. Please don't forget to subscribe, like and share. However, before we start, here are some wonderful talents that have missed out on the list altogether. First on the list is Labi Ben Barak, a sublime talent who would deserve a place right at the pinnacle of this list, but the Black Pearl represented France and never his native Morocco. Considering him would have opened the door for players such as Marcel Desailly, Basile Boli, Claude Makelele and Patrick Vieira. Next is Johnny Obi Mikel. He has received a lot of criticism throughout his career, but the honors he has racked up at Chelsea, as well as his talismanic and inspirational contribution to Nigeria's 2013 African Cup of Nations triumph put him firmly in the running. He only falls short by a minuscule margin from confirming his spot among Africa's finest ever players. Next on the list is El Hadji Diouf. The two-time African Footballer of the Year has never managed to build on his promise of the early 2000s. Too much time spent away from the elite level and his failings at Liverpool resulted in a disappointing career. Next on the list is Frederick Kanouté. He was a terrific goal scorer and the first non-African born player to win the African Footballer of the Year award. His great goal scoring record with Mali never translated to continental honors, and he never won a Major League or the Champions League to match excellent scoring rates at Sevilla and West Ham. He had to settle for a haul of cup triumphs. Next on the list is Badou Ezaki, a great shot stopper who represented Morocco during a strong era for North African teams. He should make the top 20 based on aura, but tangible honors are missing. He won the 1986 African Player of the Year. He also enjoyed outstanding seasons in La Liga for Mallorca. Next on the list is Kalusha Bwalia. It's really painful to leave out this genuine icon out of the list. A one-time African Player of the Year and an elite player with PSV in Holland, arriving only after the club's European Cup triumph in 1988. His stunning solo destruction of Italy at the 1988 Olympics was the highlight of his Zambian career. It would surely have been different had the Polo Polo not been devastated by a tragic plane crash in 1993. Next on the list is Slakta Belumi, considered to be the greatest Algerian player of all time, his nation's most capped player and their cultural cornerstone during the 1980s. He has a trophy cabinet both at international level and club level, which is remarkably sparse. Next on the list is Godfrey Chitalu, scorer of glorious goals and five-time Zambian Footballer of the Year. The temperamental forward won precious little with the Zambian national side or the club side Quito United and Kabwe Warriors. Next on the list are Francois Omambik and Papa Bouba Diop. Both are responsible for iconic and almost identical World Cup goals, moments and victories, but neither man ever won a great deal at club level. Omambik did win an African Cup of Nations title with Cameroon, but Papa Bouba Diop didn't win any with Senegal. Next on the list is Asamoah Gyan, a step away from a genuinely elite end of club competition and persistent failings at the continental stage with Ghana affected Gyan's incredibly promising career. Having said that, let's get into part 1 of Africa's 50 greatest footballers of all time. Mustafa Hajji was an agile, innovative, imaginative attacking midfielder who excelled with the ball on his feet and a defense ahead of him. He was named African Player of the Year in 1998, the only non-West African to win the award in over 2 decades. He qualified for 2 World Cups with the Moroccan national team in 1994 and impressed at France 1998. His showing against Norway remains one of the finest performances by an African player on the global stage. The Atlas Lions never quite flourished in the continental competition during this time, and Hajji never won the African Cup of Nations. His top-start club career saw him spend time in Germany, Spain, Portugal and even Luxembourg. Mustafa Hajji is fondly remembered for his time in England with Coventry City, but was powerless to prevent the Sky Blues from relegation in 2001. He won the FA Cup with Aston Villa, the Portuguese Cup with Sporting Lisbon and League Two with Nantes. The cornerstone of the Cameroonian side that saw desert at the turn of the millennium, Mark-Vivian Four's life was cut short during the 2003 Confederations Cup as he suffered a heart failure. Mark-Vivian Four won 2 African Cup of Nations titles with Cameroon in 2000 and 2002 and also represented the side at the 1994 and the 2002 World Cups. He would have been present at the 1998 World Cup as well, but he missed out due to injury. Mark-Vivian was a French league champion with both Lens and Lyon, and he also won a couple of French league cups and the Cameroonian Cup with Canon Yaoundé. Named by the International Federation of Football History as the 10th best African player of the last century, Finidi George was a senior swinger who, at least during the early part of his career, was a direct and menacing threat from the flanks. Considered among the finest wingers in the world during the 1990s, but not so much during his failed stint in England with Ipswich Town. Finidi George represented Nigeria at the 1994 and the 1998 World Cups and was also part of the Super Eagles' irresistible 1994 AFCON winning side. He made a subsequent 3 continental semi-finals with Nigeria. Finidi George was finally finished with honours at Ajax Amsterdam, where, alongside countryman Karim, he won the 1995 UEFA Champions League and lost in the final in 1996. He also picked up 3 Dutch league titles, a UEFA Super Cup, an Intercontinental Cup, and 2 Dutch Super Cups. Second place African Footballer of the Year in 1970 and third place 3 years later, Poko was a big game player and is considered as one of the continent's finest ever forwards. He was an excellent dribbler and a terrifically efficient finisher. Many would argue that only Rashidi, Yakini and Roger Miller have made an individual impact at the African Cup of Nations comparable to that of Laurent Poko. The Ivorian was top scorer twice in 1968 and 1970 and was also the player of the tournament in the latter competition. He forged a fine career in France during the 1970s, having won almost all there was to win in the Côte d'Ivoire with ASEC Abidjan. His time at Nantes was heavily affected by injury, but before that he managed to score 44 goals in 63 outings for Rennes. Another member of the Côte d'Ivoire's famed golden generation, the elder Tarak, was an athletic and imposing centre-back who has had his fair share of controversy and mishap. Kolo suffered the misfortune of his countrymen, as the consecutive incarnation of the elephant had often stumbled at the business end of the African Cup of Nations. However, he managed to win the African Cup of Nations with Côte d'Ivoire in 2015. He represented Côte d'Ivoire at 2 World Cup finals in 2010 and 2014. Having enjoyed Premier League life with Arsenal, Manchester City and Liverpool, Kolo was no stranger to domestic success. He won the Premier League twice and the Ivorian Championship twice with ASEC Mimosas. He was one of Arsene Wenger's invincibles, having been acquired from ASEC Mimosas for a mere £150,000. Segun odegbami was known as mathematical during his playing days. He made it to the podium for the African Footballer of the Year in both 1977 and 1980 without having won the big one. Odegbami was recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as the joint 19th best African player of the last century. Odegbami guided Nigeria to their maiden African Cup of Nations title on home soil in 1980. He was twice the top scorer in the African Cup of Nations in 1978 and 1980 and remains Nigeria's second highest scorer of all time, behind only the peerless Rashidi Yakini. He spent his whole career at Ibadan side Shooting Stars, picking up numerous Nigerian leagues and domestic trophies in the process. The highlight of his club career was perhaps the Africa Cup Winners' Cup of 1976, the first triumph by a Nigerian side in a continental competition. Surely one of the finest and certainly one of the most consistent defenders Africa has ever produced, Noureddine was a stalwart for Morocco and also made a successful transition to European football. He was another great African defender linked with Manchester United. Naybet represented the Atlas Lions in 2 World Cups, but like Mustafa Hajji, he remained unfulfilled at the African Cup of Nations. He won the African Champions League with Wydad Casablanca in 1992, a triumph which earned him a move across the Mediterranean. He won the Spanish Championship with Deportivo La Coruna in 2000, before further supplementing his trophy haul with a number of Spanish caps. Victor Ikpeba was recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as the joint 34th best African player of the last century. He was named African Footballer of the Year in 1997 and won the Ebony Shoe as the finest African player in the Belgium League in 1993. A continental champion with Nigeria in 1994, Ikpeba was also part of the Nigerian team that won Olympic gold 2 years later. He represented Nigeria at 2 World Cup finals in 1994 and 1998. A League One champion with Monaco in 1997 and a Belgium Cup winner with RFC Liège in 1990, Ikpeba also had a stint with Borussia Dortmund. A big game player and a key influence in numerous important clashes, the forward was one of the first and most visible African-born players to represent the French national side. He remains the second highest scorer in the history of AS Saint-Etienne. Makhloufi failed to win much with Algeria, and his greatest contribution came as part of the Front de Libération Nationale side that traveled the world, representing their countrymen then under the French rule. The FLN team became one of Africa's most potent symbols of national unity and autonomy. He represented France 4 times, but also played for Algeria at the 1982 World Cup. Some of the other North African players, often viewed as being among the continent's finest, don't have pure honors to back their status. This is not a criticism that can be leveled against Makhloufi, who excelled in France with Saint-Etienne. During his time with Saint-Etienne, he won the League One title 4 times and also acquired a clutch of other honors, including the French Cup. The victory in 1968 proved to be the last act of his glorious career. A wild boy earlier in his career, Song gently emerged as a wise old head of Cameroonian football, becoming an African icon in the process. Song remains, along with Zinedine Zidane, the only player to be sent off at 2 World Cups. A 2-time African Cup of Nations winner, Song was the tournament's starman in 2002 as the Indomitable Lions retained their continental crown. He has represented the Central African Giants at a remarkable 4 World Cups, the most by any player on the list. International success has not been reflected in his club career, which explains his fairly modest standing in this list. 2 Super League titles at Galatasaray and a handful of domestic cups in Turkey and France are the sum of his career honors out of Cameroon's famous green. Lassana Diarra was a tough-tackling midfielder who, along with Michael Essien, forged the basis of that excellent Lyon side that so often threatened to take the French side to the next level between 2002 and 2008. He was the Mali captain who guided the team to 3rd place at the Under-20 World Cup in 1999, but struggled to win anything with the Malian senior team. Diarra's place on this list is all about his domestic form. Between 2002 and 2008, he won a league title, be it in France with Olympique Lyon or in Spain with Real Madrid, winning a total of 6 consecutive major titles, not to mention a swathe of domestic cups. Daniel Amokachi was recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as the 18th best African player of the last century. His failings at Everton, where he struggled to muscle his way past Duncan Ferguson and Paul Rideout, should not diminish his standing. Twice he came 3rd in the African Player of the Year award. Daniel Amokachi played at the World Cups of 1994 and 1998 with Nigeria and was also a key member of the iconic Super Eagles side that won the African Cup of Nations in 1994. He also won a historic Olympic gold medal in 1996, playing his part in a famous final victory over Argentina. He managed to win the FA Cup at Everton in 1995, having eliminated Tottenham Hotspur in the semi-final with a terrific brace. Lucas Radebe was an elegant and consistent defender who led by example and enjoyed a storied career in South Africa and Yorkshire. Leeds United's Player of the Season in 1998, he could have achieved more had he moved to Manchester United when Sir Alex Ferguson came calling in 2000. Lucas Radebe, who was once identified by Nelson Mandela as the great man's hero, was one of the nation builders who won the African Cup of Nations with South Africa in 1996. He also represented Bafana Bafana at 2 World Cup finals in 1998 and 2002. He arrived in Leeds in 1994, primarily to provide company for his compatriot Phil Masinga. Little was expected of the Kaizer Chiefs youngster, but he became a stalwart of the side, one of the Premier League's most established defenders and a Yorkshire legend. Lucas Radebe never won a major league title, but still managed to collect various trophies in South Africa before the adventure began. This marvelous Tunisian playmaker was named Footballer of the Year in 1977 and was recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as the joint 15th best player of the last century. He never managed to guide Tunisia to African Cup of Nations title, but did give the world a glimpse of his and his compatriots' talent at the 1978 World Cup in Mexico. Diab enjoyed a trophy-laden career with Esperance, but retired before the club won their first ever CAF Champions League. Karim Abdul Razak may not be a household name to most of African football fans, but the Ghanaian midfielder had a miraculous close ball control and an outstanding record. A one-time African Player of the Year, in 1978 he was recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as the joint 31st best African player of the last century. Abdul Razak was the player of the tournament at the 1978 African Cup of Nations as he guided the Black Stars to their third African title. Abdul Razak enjoyed a stint in the NLSL among the glittering stars of the New York Cosmos, sandwiched between time in Ghana with Asante Kotoko and in Egypt with Arab contractors. Africa has produced a multitude of players who knew how to find the net with unflinching regularity. However, unlike Godfrey Chitalu and Tony Eboa, for example, Rashidi Yakini has the honors to back up his tremendous work in front of goal. The Bull of Kaduna was once named African Footballer of the Year and has also come in second and third place in the voting. He was recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as the 17th best African player of the last century. He was part of the Nigerian team that conquered Africa in 1994, and he also starred at the World Cup in America later that year. He was the top scorer in 2 continental championships and was the player of the tournament in 1994. Rashidi Yakini played across Africa and in Europe, in Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Switzerland, winning the Ivorian title. He was the top scorer in the Premier League in 1994, an incredible year for the frontman. Joseph Antoine Bell was recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as Africa's greatest goalkeeper during the 20th century. He was twice the runner-up in the African Footballer of the Year award. He won the African Cup of Nations twice with Cameroon and also traveled to 3 World Cup finals with the indomitable Lions. Bell won the African Champions League in 1979 as part of an exceptional Union Douala side. He achieved domestic success with Union Douala and Egyptian side Arab contractors. His career in France with Olympique Marseille often threatened to deliver excellence, but the side too often fell short as the final hurdle drew near. The only one of the iconic Zaire side of the late 1960s and the early 1970s to make this list, Kazadi Mwamba, was the goalkeeper of the 1974 World Cup that had its reputation tainted by their failings, in which their numbers are almost impossible to dispute. Once a runner-up in the African Footballer of the Year, Kazadi Mwamba was recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics among the finest 5 goalkeepers of the last century. Twice an African champion, Zaire in 1968 and in 1974, the year of the Leopards' great voyage to the World Cup in West Germany, Kazadi Mwamba was named the player of the tournament following the 1968 African Cup of Nations triumph. Mwamba spent his entire career with Lubumbashi Giants TP Mazembe, picking a whole host of domestic and continental honors in the process. He's a forgotten great despite his World Cup failings. Named the African Player of the Year in 1970, Keita also received the FIFA Order of Merit in 1996. A lethal striker, on his day he enjoyed a stunning scoring record in France with Saint-Etienne. Salif Keita guided Mali to the final of the 1972 African Cup of Nations but was helpless as the Republic of Congo beat Mali 3-2 in a classic final. A relentless winner as a youngster in Mali, he transferred his desire and success to Europe. He won a trio of consecutive Ligue 1 titles with Saint-Etienne at the end of the 1960s and also enjoyed various triumphs in the French Cup. Keita picked up a Portuguese Cup with Sporting over a decade after leaving Africa. Patrick Mboma was an incredibly powerful individual with terrific technical prowess to match. He was African Footballer of the Year and the BBC African Footballer of the Year in 2000. An incredibly consistent goal scorer for the indomitable Lions, his numbers match up against almost all the other forwards on the list. Mboma won the honors to go with these goals as well as a figure in a great Cameroon side of the early 2000s. Alongside that excellent collection of stars, he won 2 African Cup of Nations titles, an Olympic gold medal, and features at 2 World Cups. One of only 6 players to be top scorer at 2 different African Cup of Nations tournaments. His successes with Cameroon were unfortunately not matched throughout his peripatetic club career. A clutch of French caps are a scant reward for such a sizzling talent. Don't let the flabby, ignominious end of his career to distract you. Benny McCarthy was once one of Africa's most feared frontmen. Despite having never won the African Cup of Nations with South Africa, Benny McCarthy was the outstanding individual in the 1998 African Cup of Nations. He both was the top scorer and identified as the tournament's finest player. He represented Bafana Bafana at 2 World Cups, but he infamously missed out on home soil in 2010. He remains South Africa's all-time top scorer. Benny McCarthy won the UEFA Champions League as part of Jose Mourinho's Porto side in 2004, having enjoyed success earlier with Ajax Amsterdam. He impressed in England at Blackburn Rovers, where he transferred his prolific goal-getting to the Premier League. Recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as the joint 34th best African player of the last century, Manga Ongwene won the CAF Footballer of the Year award in 1980. Bad timing cost him glory of his successes with the Cameroonian national side. Manga Ongwene ceased his national team duty only 3 years before the indomitable Lions' first African title. He returned to manage the national side during a brief but unsuccessful period. Manga Ongwene spent his whole career with Cameroonian powerhouses Canon Yaoundé. During a remarkable successful 16 years, he transformed the club, winning their first 6 league titles and guiding them to 3 African Champions League victories. Upon his departure in 1982, no team in Africa would have more continental championships than Canon Yaoundé. It took 14 years before Zamalek beat their impressive feat. His contributions at Barcelona, where he was an important figure without consistently holding down a first-team spot, were rarely anything less that important. Seydou Keita came in the running for the African Footballer of the Year in 2011, beaten only by Yaya Toure. A third-place finish in the FIFA Under-20 World Cup in 1999, foreshadowed by identical finishes in both the 2012 and the 2013 African Cup of Nations tournament, when Mali fell short at the semi-final stage. A favorite of Pep Guardiola, Keita picked up 3 La Liga titles, 2 Copa del Reys, 3 Supercopa de Españas, and 2 Champions League titles during his time in Barcelona. This is augmented by previous successes at Sevilla and Laurent. It is certainly true that Emmanuel Amunike didn't have a career quite as glittering as his talent should have permitted, but the fact that the player's injury record associates him eternally tells its own story. Recognized by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics as the 26th best African player of the last century, this one-time African Footballer of the Year was once a runner-up and a former BBC African Player of the Year. Not a bad haul for one so regularly stuck in the treatment room. He was part of the glorious Nigerian generation of the 90s, having won the Olympic gold medal in 1996 and an African Cup of Nations title in 1994, as well as representing Nigeria at the 1994 World Cup. Once signed by Barcelona for £2.2 million, Amunike won domestic titles in Nigeria, Egypt, before testing sporadic success in Europe and Asia. An inspirational figure within the context of African football, Abega was once named the African Footballer of the Year and finished third on another occasion. He was identified as the 6th greatest African player of the 20th century by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics. He created some of African football's most iconic images during the 1984 African Cup of Nations final, as his glorious late winner against Nigeria secured Cameroon's first continental title. He was named the player of the tournament. He also represented the Central African Giants at a World Cup. Domestically, Abega was a stalwart for Canon Yaounde for a decade, guiding the club to 2 CAF Champions League titles in 1978 and 1988. There you have it, Africa's 50 greatest footballers of all time, part 1, counting down from number 50 to number 26. Watch out for part 2, which is a countdown of number 25 to number 1. That's all for now. See you in the next video. Goodbye.